"If you can't afford dinner here, maybe you should think about selling that ring." My son said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, not looking at me with anger, not even looking at me with concern, just dismissing me. The waiter froze mid-step beside our table. I noticed the way his hand hovered in the air pen still poised over his notepad, unsure whether to pretend he hadn't heard or to wait for someone to correct what had just been said. At the next table, a couple fell silent. I could feel their attention without turning my head. Ryan finally looked at me then as if expecting a reaction, maybe embarrassment, maybe an apology. Melissa kept her eyes on her menu, but her posture tightened just slightly, like she knew exactly what he had done, and had decided not to interrupt it. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked down at the ring on my hand and let the moment settle. I simply looked down at the ring on my hand, the one his father had given me more than 40 years ago, and for a moment I wondered how something so small could suddenly feel so heavy. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a joke that landed badly. It was deliberate. And the strangest part wasn't the words themselves. It was how familiar they felt, not the exact sentence, but the tone, the quiet assumption behind it. As if I had slowly been reduced to a line item, something to manage, something to cover when needed. I had been helping them for years, quietly, consistently, without ever turning it into a conversation. Tuition when Ethan started private school, a temporary loan when Ryan wanted to expand his business, covering insurance during a rough stretch, small things he used to say, just until things stabilized. They never really did. And sitting there under the soft lighting of a restaurant I had been invited to, I realized something that settled deeper than the embarrassment. This wasn't about dinner. It never had been. That was the moment I understood that nothing in our relationship was going to correct itself. Not with time, not with patience, and not with more help. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. "I'm not going to stay," I said, my voice even almost gentle. "You two can finish your meal." Ryan blinked, caught off guard not by anger, but by the lack of it. "Mom, don't make this into something it's not." I met his eyes then. Calm. Clear. "I'm not making it into anything I said. I'm just leaving." There was a brief pause, long enough for the air around the table to shift, for the waiter to take a step back, for Melissa to finally glance up with something unreadable in her expression. I reached for my bag, stood, and walked away without waiting for another word. No one stopped me. As I moved through the restaurant, I was aware of the quiet behind me, not silence exactly, but a kind of restrained stillness, like a room holding its breath. The door closed softly when I stepped outside, and the night air felt cooler than I expected. I didn't rush. There was no scene to escape from, no urgency, just a strange clarity settling in. My name is Donna Parker. I'm 71 years old, and until that evening I believed that if you gave enough to the people you loved, eventually they would understand what it cost you. I walked to my car slowly, the sound of my footsteps steady against the pavement. Before I start from the beginning, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if stories like this speak to you, take a second to subscribe. It helps more than you think. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. If anything, I felt settled. Not because what happened didn't hurt. It did, more than I expected. But because for the first time in a very long time, something had finally become clear. I drove home through streets I knew by heart, passing familiar houses, familiar lights. Nothing had changed out there. Everything looked exactly the same. And yet something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew this wasn't going to be a conversation I could smooth over. It wasn't something I could fix with patience or understanding. Some things once seen clearly don't go back to the way they were. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the quiet around me pressing in just enough to make me notice it. That was when it truly settled in. I hadn't just walked out of a restaurant. I had stepped out of something I had been holding together for years without realizing how much it was costing me. The house greeted me the way it always did, familiar, unchanged, and quietly waiting. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing just a little longer than usual. For a moment, I stood there without turning on the lights, letting my eyes adjust to the dim outline of the living room. The shapes were all where they had always been. The couch, the small table by the window, the framed photographs along the wall, nothing had moved. And yet something felt different. I set my bag down on the chair near the door and slipped off my shoes, placing them side by side with a kind of care I hadn't consciously intended. It was a habit, I realized, the kind you keep when there's no one else around to notice, but you still do it anyway. In the kitchen, I reached for the kettle, filled it halfway, and set it on the stove. The simple rhythm of the action steadied me, water flame waiting. I didn't rush it. There was no reason to. As the kettle warmed, I leaned lightly against the counter and let my mind drift, not toward what had just happened, but further back. It didn't start with that dinner. I think I always knew that, even before I was ready to admit it. There had been small moments over the years, easy to overlook on their own, reasonable even. Just for a little while, Mom. Ryan had said that the first time he asked for help after college, he had found a place he liked but needed a bit more to cover the deposit. It wasn't a large amount, and he had seemed almost embarrassed asking. I remember how quickly I reassured him. Of course, I said, that's what I'm here for, and I meant it. Later, when Ethan was accepted into a private school, Ryan called again. He explained it carefully. Opportunities, connections, a better future. It sounded important. It sounded right. I'll pay you back, he said, just until things settle. I didn't ask how long that would be. At the time, it didn't seem necessary. The kettle began to hum softly, and I poured the hot water into a cup, watching the steam rise in slow, twisting lines. I carried it to the living room and sat down, the warmth settling into my hands as much as the tea itself. There were other moments. A car that needed replacing sooner than expected. Insurance that had become temporarily difficult to manage. A business opportunity that required just a bit more investment to get off the ground. The requests always came in the same tone, reasonable, temporary, almost reluctant. And I answered them the same way. No hesitation, no conditions. It never felt like giving something up. It felt like supporting family. But somewhere along the way, the language had changed. The calls became shorter. Less explanation, more assumption. Hey, Mom, I just need you to cover this month. I'll figure it out next quarter. Not, can you help anymore? Just, I need. I stared into my cup, the surface barely disturbed, and tried to remember exactly when that shift had happened. There wasn't a single moment I could point to. No clear line between then and now. It had been gradual, quiet, almost invisible, and that I realized was what made it so easy to ignore. Melissa had always been polite in her way. She smiled when we met, asked about my health, commented on the house, but there was a distance to it, something careful and contained. She rarely asked questions that went beyond the surface, never stayed long enough for conversations to deepen. And yet when plans were made, vacations, renovations, new purchases, my name appeared in the background, attached to the part no one discussed out loud. Ryan handled those conversations. He always had. Mom understands, he would say. And I did. Or at least I thought I did. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth settle before continuing the thought I hadn't fully formed yet. Understanding wasn't the same as agreement. And agreement, I was beginning to see, had never really been asked for. I set the cup down and leaned back slightly, my gaze drifting toward the photographs on the wall. Ryan as a child, grinning with a gap between his teeth. Ryan at graduation, standing taller, looking certain of something I couldn't quite see anymore. I had been there for every version of him, every step, every fall. So when had I stopped being someone he turned to, and started being something he relied on? That question stayed with me, quiet but persistent, because the answer wasn't in what he had said at dinner. It was in everything that had come before it. That evening hadn't changed anything. It had only revealed it. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not sharp, just steady. For years I had told myself that helping meant holding things together, that if I stayed patient, if I stayed generous, things would find their balance again. But sitting there in a house that had not asked anything of me except to exist within it, I could feel something settling into place with a clarity I hadn't allowed before. This wasn't about one request, or one conversation. It was a pattern, and patterns don't correct themselves unless something interrupts them. I glanced toward the hallway toward the small desk where I kept old documents, bank statements, and records I hadn't looked at in a long time. I already knew what I would find if I went through them, not because I had memorized the numbers, but because deep down I had always understood the shape of it. Still, I hadn't opened that drawer. Not yet, and for a moment I remained exactly where I was sitting in the quiet, aware that the next step wasn't about discovering something new. It was about finally choosing to look at what had been there all along. For a while I stayed where I was, letting the thought settle without acting on it. Then I stood up. The hallway felt longer than usual as I walked toward the small desk tucked against the wall. It wasn't anything special, just a place where I kept things I didn't need every day but couldn't bring myself to throw away. Papers, old envelopes, statements I had once meant to organize. I pulled open the drawer. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it, neat in a way that suggested order even if I hadn't looked at any of it in months. I reached in and took out a folder, plain, slightly worn at the edges. For a moment I just held it. Then I opened it. The first page was a bank statement. I recognized the account immediately, not because I checked it often, but because I knew what it was used for. Transfers. I sat down at the desk and began turning the pages one at a time. Each line was simple on its own. A date, an amount, a short description. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand out to anyone glancing quickly. But taken together, they formed something else entirely. Monthly transfers, consistent, uninterrupted. Mortgage support, tuition payments, insurance coverage, car expenses. Occasional temporary boosts that appeared more than once, sometimes labeled differently, but always serving the same purpose. I moved to the next statement. Then the next. The numbers didn't shock me, not at first. They felt familiar in the way something does when you've lived with it long enough without naming it. I had seen these figures before in passing, approved them, allowed them, but I had never sat down and looked at all of them together. Not like this. I took a pen from the drawer and began marking the recurring entries, grouping them in the margin. Mortgage, school insurance, every category forming a pattern that had been there all along. The categories formed quickly. Too quickly. And as they did, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't occasional help. This wasn't temporary. This was structure. I leaned back slightly, the pen still in my hand, and let my eyes move across the page again. Years of entries, years of quiet decisions that had never felt like decisions at all, until now. I flipped to the most recent statement and paused there, my attention drawn not to a single number, but to the total at the bottom. That was when the weight of it finally settled. Not because I didn't recognize the amount, but because I could no longer pretend it was smaller than it was. I closed the folder, halfway, my hand resting on the cover. For a long time, I had told myself that this was what support looked like, that families adjusted, that things evened out over time. But sitting there with everything laid out in front of me, I understood something I hadn't been willing to say before. Nothing about this had been evening out. It had been building, and I had been the one holding it up. I exhaled slowly and closed the folder completely. That was the moment the question changed. It wasn't, how much have I given? It was, why am I still giving it this way? I stood, picked up my keys, and left the house without hesitating. The drive to the bank felt shorter than usual, or maybe I just didn't notice the distance. My thoughts weren't scattered anymore. They were aligned in a way that felt unfamiliar, but steady, clear. I parked, stepped inside, and approached the counter. The space was bright, orderly, and impersonal in the way banks tend to be. A few people stood in line. Someone was speaking quietly to a teller in the corner. When it was my turn, I stepped forward. "I need to make some changes to my account," I said. The man behind the counter nodded politely. "Of course. What kind of changes?" I placed the folder on the counter but didn't open it. "I want to stop all recurring transfers linked to this account." He paused just slightly. Not long enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. "All of them?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at his screen, then back at me. "There are several active payments here. Are you sure you want to cancel everything at once?" There it was, a moment to reconsider. I didn't take it. "Yes," I said, my voice even. "All of them." He nodded again, slower this time, and began typing. The soft sound of the keyboard filled the space between us. Clicks, pauses, confirmations. Just to verify, he said, glancing up briefly, this will include monthly transfers totaling approximately $8,400. $8,400. Hearing it spoken aloud was different. It gave the number shape, weight, presence. I didn't look away. That's correct. If you've been listening this far, I want to ask you something. What would you do in that moment? Would you stop? Would you hesitate? Or would you keep going? Let me know in the comments. And if you think moments like this matter more than we admit, take a second to like the video. It helps more people see it. The banker turned back to his screen, continuing the process. There was a brief pause as he navigated through confirmations, each step requiring acknowledgement, each one moving the decision forward. Once I finalize this, he said the changes will take effect immediately. Any scheduled transfers from this point on will be canceled. I nodded. That's what I want. He hovered for a fraction of a second before clicking. Something shifted, not around me, not in the room, but in the space where those payments had existed for so long. Invisible, automatic, unquestioned. Gone. He printed a document and slid it across the counter. Please review and sign here. I glanced down at the page, lines of text, figures, terms I understood well enough not to question. I signed. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, my hand steady. No hesitation, no second thought. When I handed it back, he offered a polite, neutral smile. Everything has been updated. You'll receive a confirmation shortly. Thank you, I said. I picked up the folder, though I no longer needed it, and turned to leave. The door opened, then closed behind me, the outside air cooler than before. I stood there for a moment, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything to happen next. Just noticing. For years I had told myself that I was helping, that I was doing what needed to be done. But standing there with nothing left to approve, nothing left to cover, I understood something far simpler. I wasn't stepping away from them. I was stepping back into something I had set aside without realizing it. Myself. I didn't go home right away. For a few minutes I just stood outside the bank, the folder still in my hand, feeling the quiet settle differently this time. Not heavy, not uncertain, just unfamiliar. There had always been something waiting after I helped them. Another call, another need, another adjustment I had to make without quite realizing I was the one adjusting. But now there was nothing pending, no transfer scheduled, no payment quietly moving in the background. For the first time in years, there was no next step already decided for me. I got into my car slowly and sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I expected to feel something sharper, guilt maybe, or hesitation. But what came instead was something steadier, a kind of awareness I hadn't allowed myself before. Helping had never felt wrong. I still didn't think it was. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing the difference between helping and carrying. And I had been carrying far more than I realized. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence stretch naturally around me. My thoughts weren't rushing ahead. They were catching up. There were practical things I hadn't considered yet, consequences I hadn't mapped out. Ryan would notice, not immediately perhaps. Some of the payments might overlap for a few days a week at most, but eventually the absence would become visible. And when it did, he would call. I could already imagine how that conversation might begin. Confusion first, then frustration, maybe disbelief. What I couldn't predict was whether he would understand, or whether he would even try. I stopped at a light and watched as a group of people crossed the street ahead of me, moving at different speeds, each one focused on their own destination. For a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to move like that forward without constantly adjusting for someone else. When the light changed, I continued driving, but not toward home. Instead, I turned toward the part of town where I hadn't needed to go in a long time. Legal offices, financial planning, the kinds of places that dealt in decisions you couldn't easily undo. The building I had in mind wasn't far. I had been there once before, years ago, when Daniel and I updated our will. At the time, it had felt like something distant, procedural, a task to complete and then set aside. I parked across the street and sat for a moment looking up at the sign. Collins and Baker LLP. The name hadn't changed. I wondered briefly if anything else had. Inside the office was just as I remembered, quiet, organized with a calm that came from everything having its place. A receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you? I'd like to speak with someone about updating my estate plan," I said. She nodded, typing something into her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I replied, "but I've worked with your firm before." "It's been a while." She glanced at the screen again, then back at me. "Let me see who's available." A few minutes later, I was led down a hallway and into a small office where a man stood as I entered. "Mrs. Parker," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Andrew Collins." His voice was measured, professional, but not distant. "Thank you for seeing me," I said, taking his hand briefly. "Of course. Please have a seat." I sat across from him, placing the folder on the desk, though I didn't open it yet. He waited, giving me space to begin in my own time. "I need to make some changes," I said. He nodded once. "All right. What kind of changes are you considering?" I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to say it clearly. "My current arrangements don't reflect my intentions anymore." He didn't interrupt, just listened. "I've been supporting my son and his family financially for several years," I continued. "That support has been consistent, structured. I didn't need to explain further. The word itself carried enough weight." "And you'd like to change that going forward?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I already have." Something in his expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but recognition, as if he understood that whatever had led me here hadn't happened all at once. "And in terms of your estate?" he asked. I looked down at the folder for a moment, then back at him. "I want to make sure that what I leave behind goes to the people who are actually present in my life, not just the ones who expect it." He nodded again, slower this time. "That's a reasonable place to start." There was no judgment in his tone, no suggestion that I should reconsider, just acknowledgement. He reached for a pen and a notepad. "We can review your current documents and discuss what changes you'd like to make. That may include updating beneficiaries, restructuring any trusts, or creating new provisions depending on your goals." His words were precise, but not overwhelming. For the first time that day, I felt something settle into place with a different kind of certainty. This wasn't about reacting anymore. It was about deciding. "I'd like to go through everything," I said. "Carefully." "Of course," he replied. "We'll take it step by step." He turned slightly toward his computer, pulling up what I assumed were my previous records. "Before we begin," he added, "I just want to confirm you're making these changes of your own choosing." I met his eyes. Yes. There was no hesitation in my answer. He nodded, satisfied, and began outlining the process, what documents we would review, what changes could be made, what would require new filings. I listened, not trying to absorb every detail at once, but understanding the direction clearly enough. For years, decisions like this had felt distant, abstract, something you prepared for someday. But sitting there in that office, I understood that someday had already arrived. And this time, I wasn't preparing for the future. I was correcting the present. Andrew placed a stack of documents in front of me, aligning them carefully. "We'll start here," he said. I looked down at the first page, my name printed neatly at the top. Everything that came next would follow from this moment. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide what that should look like. Andrew didn't rush me. He let the room settle into a steady rhythm, paper against wood, the quiet hum of the building around us, the kind of stillness that made decisions feel less like reactions and more like something deliberate. "We'll begin with your existing documents," he said, turning the first page toward me, "your will and the trust structure you and your husband set up." I nodded. Daniel had insisted on that years ago. Not out of fear, but out of habit, he liked things to be in order. At the time, I had followed his lead, signed where I needed to, trusted that it would all take care of itself. Back then, it had felt complete. Now it felt outdated. Andrew scanned the document briefly, then looked up. "At the moment, your estate is structured to pass primarily to your son with secondary provisions if circumstances change. That's fairly standard. Yes, I said. It made sense then, and now it doesn't. The question wasn't sharp, just precise. No, I answered. It doesn't. He nodded once and made a small note. All right, then we'll talk about what you want it to reflect now. That was the part that mattered. Not what had been written years ago, not what had been assumed, what I chose now with full awareness of what those choices meant. I want to remove the automatic assumption, I said carefully, that everything goes to Ryan. Andrew didn't react immediately. He simply listened. And I want to make sure that what I leave is aligned with presence, with involvement, not expectation. He leaned back slightly, considering my words. So you're looking to change primary beneficiaries and possibly restructure the trust to reflect different conditions? Yes. He tapped his pen lightly once against the desk. That can be done. There are a few ways to approach it depending on how much flexibility you want to retain. I want control, I said, not just over who receives what, but how and when. That more than anything seemed to clarify the direction of the conversation. All right, he said, in that case we may want to revise your existing trust rather than simply updating the will. A living trust gives you more direct control while you're still able to manage it. I remember, I said. Daniel explained that. Andrew nodded. Then you already understand the basics. You remain the trustee. You can adjust terms as needed. And you can define distribution conditions more precisely. Conditions. The word lingered for a moment. Not as punishment, not as a way to control anyone else, but as a way to define what I was and wasn't responsible for anymore. I'd like to name someone else as a primary beneficiary, I said. He looked at me, waiting. My granddaughter Lily, I continued. She's been present, consistent. I didn't elaborate further. I didn't need to. Andrew made another note. And your son, I considered the question not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to say it without anger. He doesn't need to be excluded entirely, I said, but I don't want him to receive everything automatically. If anything is left to him, it should be structured, limited. Andrew nodded again, his expression neutral but attentive. We can create conditional distributions, for example, a fixed amount or access tied to specific circumstances. That would be better, I said. There was a difference between cutting someone off completely and redefining the terms of what remained. I wasn't trying to erase Ryan. I was trying to step out of a pattern. Andrew turned a page and pointed to a section of the current trust. Right now there are no restrictions. Everything transfers directly. That's what will be changing. I followed his finger across the text, recognizing the simplicity of it. At the time, simplicity had felt like trust. Now it felt like absence. We'll also want to review any accounts or assets that are currently linked to that structure, he added. Property, savings, investments, anything that would be included in the estate. My house is fully paid off, I said, and most of my accounts are in my name. That gives you flexibility, he replied. We can align everything under the revised trust to ensure consistency. Consistency. That was what had been missing. Not in the paperwork, but in the way I had allowed things to continue without adjustment. I'd like everything to reflect the same intention, I said. No gaps. Andrew gave a small nod of approval. That's the right approach. He began outlining the changes in more concrete terms. Now, what documents would need to be amended, what new provisions would be added, how the structure would look once everything was in place. I listened carefully, asking questions when something needed clarification, but not overcomplicating what was already clear. This wasn't about mastering legal language. It was about making sure my choices were accurately represented. At one point, he paused and looked at me more directly. I want to be sure of something, he said. You're comfortable with these changes. There's no external pressure influencing this decision. I held his gaze. There's pressure, I said, but it's not coming from outside. He didn't ask me to explain. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and continued. We moved through the rest of the discussion with the same steady pace. Adjustments, clarifications, small decisions that added up to something much larger. By the time he finished outlining the revised structure, the path ahead felt defined in a way it hadn't before. Clear not because it was simple, but because it was intentional. Andrew gathered the documents into a neat stack and aligned them in front of me. These will need to be finalized and signed once you've reviewed everything, he said. Take your time with it. There's no need to rush. I looked down at the pages, my name appearing again and again in places where decisions were being reshaped. For years, those decisions had been guided by habit, by assumption, by a sense of obligation I hadn't questioned closely enough. Now they were mine again. I will, I said quietly. I closed the folder not with hesitation, but with a kind of measured patience. There was nothing left to discover here, only something left to confirm. And this time I would do it knowing exactly what it meant. The call came 2 days later. I was in the kitchen rinsing a cup I hadn't quite finished when my phone lit up on the counter. Ryan's name appeared on the screen, steady and familiar, as if nothing had changed. For a moment, I just looked at it, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet awareness. This was the moment I had already imagined, the one that had been waiting since I walked out of the bank. I dried my hands, picked up the phone, and answered. Hello. There was no greeting on his end, no pause. Mom, what happened to the account? Straight to it. I'm not sure what you mean, I said, my voice even. There was a short exhale sharp enough to carry frustration, but not yet anger. The transfers. They didn't go through this month. Mortgage school, none of it. I checked twice. Something's wrong. I leaned lightly against the counter, letting the weight of his words settle without reacting to the urgency behind them. Nothing's wrong, I said. I stopped them. There was a silence then, not empty but tense, the kind that gathers quickly when something expected doesn't happen. You stopped them, he repeated slower now. Yes? Why would you do that? His voice shifted, confusion giving way to something tighter. We've got payments lined up. You know that. I do. Then why would you just cut everything off without saying anything? I let the question hang for a moment before answering. Because it wasn't something I was going to discuss the way we've discussed it before. That didn't land well. What does that even mean? He asked, his tone rising slightly. This isn't a small thing, Mom. You can't just decide something like that on your own. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but to steady the space between what he was saying and what I needed to say next. It is my decision, I replied. It always was. Another pause. This one longer. I could hear something shifting on his side papers maybe, or the movement of someone pacing. We had an understanding, he said finally. You were helping until things stabilized. That's what you said, I answered. And they haven't stabilized yet, he pushed back. You know how things are right now. I opened my eyes and looked out the window, watching the light move across the yard. Yes, I said. I do know how things are. Then I don't understand why you'd do this now of all times. Because now I understand something I didn't before. I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I chose something simpler. Because it's been years, Ryan. The line went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less reactive, more deliberate. That's not fair, he said. We've been building something. You've seen that. I have, I replied, and I've been part of it. There was a shift in his breathing, a sign that he was recalculating. Okay, he said, more controlled now. Then let's talk about it. If something's changed, we can adjust. Maybe not everything at once, but we can figure something out. There it was, the familiar rhythm, adjustment, compromise, continuation. I recognized it immediately, and for the first time I didn't step into it. I'm not looking to adjust it, I said. What do you mean you're not looking to adjust it? His voice sharpened again. You're just going to leave us like this. I'm not leaving you, I said quietly. I'm stepping back from something that shouldn't have been structured this way to begin with. That doesn't make any sense, he replied. You've been doing this for years. Why is it suddenly a problem now? Because I finally looked at it. Because I stopped pretending it was temporary. Because I realized it wasn't support. It was dependency. Again, I didn't say all of that. Not because it wasn't true, but because I didn't need to prove it. I'm not going to continue the transfers. I let the words sit for a moment before adding, that part isn't changing. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. So that's it. No conversation, no warning. There's a conversation now, I said. That's not the same thing, he snapped. We've got responsibilities. Ethan's school alone, do you know what that costs? Yes, I said. I do. And you're just going to let that fall apart? I felt the weight of that question, not because it was new, but because it had always been there quietly implied in every request. If you don't help, something will fall. I let the thought pass through without holding on to it. I trust you'll figure out what needs to be done, I said. That's not an answer, he replied. It is, I said gently. It's just not the one you want. There was a long pause, long enough that I could almost feel the distance between us taking shape in real time. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said finally, his voice lower now. No, I answered. I'm making it different. Another silence, this one heavier. I don't think you understand what this is going to do, he said. I rested my hand on the counter, steady grounded. I think I understand it more clearly than I have in a long time. And you're okay with that, I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted him to hear the absence of hesitation when I did. Yes, I said. There was nothing else to add to that. No explanation, no justification. Just the line I had drawn, and the choice to stand behind it. Ryan didn't call again that day, but the silence that followed wasn't calm. It had weight to it, like something gathering just out of sight. The next message came the following morning. Not a call this time. A text. We need to talk. This isn't sustainable. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding. Not because I didn't understand what he meant, but because I recognized the shift in tone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and behind it the same assumption I had been stepping away from. I went about my morning as usual, coffee, a short walk, the small routines that had always grounded my days. But there was a difference now. The anticipation wasn't something I felt responsible for managing. By midday, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Ryan. Donna Melissa's voice came through careful, almost measured in a way I hadn't heard before. Yes. There was a brief pause as if she were deciding how to begin. I wanted to reach out, she said. About what's going on. I didn't interrupt. We're trying to understand what happened, she continued. Ryan's been going through the accounts and things just don't add up the way they used to. I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening. There's nothing unclear about it, I said. The transfers have stopped. Yes, we can see that, she replied quickly. But it's more than that. We've made decisions based on those numbers, long-term ones. There it was again, not a request, an expectation that had already been built into something larger. I understand that, I said. Do you? Her voice tightened just slightly, because right now it feels like everything's shifting at once. I let that settle for a moment. Some things needed to shift, I answered. Another pause. Donna. She said, her tone softer now, but more deliberate. We're not asking for everything to go back exactly the way it was, but maybe there's a middle ground here, a way to ease into this instead of cutting it off all at once. The phrasing was careful, thoughtful even, but the direction was the same. Adjustment, gradual return, continuation under a different name. I'm not looking for a middle ground, I said. There was a slight intake of breath on the other end. That's a bit extreme, don't you think, she asked. No, I replied. I think it's clear. Her tone changed after that. Not dramatically, not loudly. But something underneath it shifted, something less concerned with understanding and more focused on control. We've built our life around a certain level of stability, she said. The house, the school, everything. We didn't do that recklessly. I didn't say you did. But you're removing a major part of how that stability works, she continued, without any kind of transition. I stood and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. I didn't create that structure on my own, I said. It developed over time. Yes, she replied, and you were part of that. I was. Then don't you think you have some responsibility to maintain it? The question was direct, clear, and familiar. For years I would have answered it without hesitation. Now I considered it differently. I had a responsibility to recognize what it had become, I said, and to decide whether it should continue. And you decided it shouldn't, she said flatly. Yes. There was no space left for interpretation in that answer. You're putting us in a difficult position, she said. I understand that, I replied, but you're still going through with it. I am. Another silence followed, this one thinner, sharper. I could almost hear her recalculating, adjusting the approach the same way Ryan had. Ryan mentioned you went to see a lawyer, she said finally. I didn't respond immediately. Is that true? She pressed. Yes, I said. For what purpose? To review my estate plan? There was a brief pause, short but noticeable. So you're changing things, she said. I'm updating them, I replied, and we're just finding out about this now. There wasn't anything to discuss before the decisions were made. Her composure slipped slightly at that. That's not how families usually handle things, she said. No, I answered. It's not how we've handled them before. And that's a problem now, it is. I could feel the distance between us settling into something more defined, not conflict in the usual sense. Not raised voices or sharp words, but something firmer, more permanent. Okay, she said after a moment, her voice quieter now but colder. Then I think you should understand what this is going to look like from our side. I didn't interrupt. We're going to have to make some hard decisions, she continued, about the house, about Ethan's school, about everything. I expected that, I said. And you're comfortable with that? She asked. I didn't answer right away, not because I doubted it, but because I understood what she was really asking. Are you willing to let things fall if we can't hold them together without you? I let the question pass through me without settling. I'm comfortable with my decision, I said. There was nothing more to negotiate after that, no adjustment left to offer, only the reality of what came next, and for the first time, I wasn't stepping in to soften it. The invitation arrived 3 days later. It wasn't a call this time, just a message from Ryan, short, neutral, almost formal. Ethan has a school event this Friday. If you want to come, it starts at 6. No mention of the conversation we'd had, no acknowledgement of anything that had shifted between us, just information. I read it once, then again, noticing the distance in the wording. Not unkind, not cold, just careful. I replied with a simple confirmation. I'll be there. Friday evening came quietly. I chose a simple outfit, something comfortable, something that didn't draw attention, not because I wanted to disappear, but because I didn't need to be seen to know why I was going. The school auditorium was already half full when I arrived. Rows of chairs stretched across the room, parents and families settling into conversations that overlapped in low, steady waves. Laughter here and there, the rustle of programs, the soft hum of a shared moment that belonged to everyone at once. I paused just inside the entrance, letting my eyes adjust, scanning for a familiar face. I saw Ryan first. He was standing near the front, talking to another parent. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he hadn't been looking for me. Melissa stood a few feet away, speaking with someone else. Her expression composed her attention, fully engaged in the conversation she was having. Neither of them turned. For a moment I considered walking over, then I didn't. Instead, I moved quietly along the side of the room and found an empty seat near the back. Not hidden, but not central either. A place where I could see everything without needing to be part of it. People continued to arrive, filling the space with motion and sound. Chairs shifted, voices rose and fell, names were called across the room. No one called mine. I sat with my hands folded lightly in my lap, watching as the room settled into itself, watching as Ryan and Melissa took their seats closer to the front, still without noticing me, or perhaps noticing and choosing not to acknowledge. It didn't matter which. What mattered was how familiar the feeling was, not the setting, not the event, but the quiet way presence could exist without recognition. The program began with a series of introductions. Teachers stepped onto the stage one after another, speaking about the students, their progress, their achievements. Applause came in polite waves, rising and falling as names were called. I followed along, listening, but not entirely focused on the words. My attention drifted instead to the space between things. to the way people leaned toward each other when something felt meaningful, the way parents smiled before their children were even called, the way recognition moved through the room like a current connecting people who were already looking for it. I remained where I was, outside of it, not excluded, just unclaimed. At some point, Ryan stood briefly adjusting his jacket as Ethan's name appeared in the program. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening in anticipation. Neither of them turned around. I didn't expect them to. Still, I felt the distance settle more clearly than before, not as something painful, but as something defined. Ethan walked onto the stage a few minutes later, taller than I remembered, his steps steady, but not entirely confident. He looked out at the audience, scanning faces in a way that felt instinctive, searching for something familiar. For a moment, his gaze moved past me. Then it stopped, just briefly, but long enough that I knew he had seen me. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. Just a small pause, a recalibration, as if the room had changed shape in a way only he could feel. The teacher beside him began speaking, outlining his accomplishments, his progress, the qualities that had stood out over the year. Words like dedicated, thoughtful, consistent. Ryan and Melissa listened from the front, their attention fixed on the stage. Ethan stood quietly, waiting for his turn. When the teacher stepped aside and handed him the microphone, there was a brief ripple of applause. He hesitated for a second, then brought it closer. I wasn't planning to say much. He began, his voice steady but softer than the room expected. But I think I should. A few people shifted in their seats. The room adjusted around the change in tone. Ethan looked out again, his eyes moving across the audience. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "My grandmother is here tonight." The words landed differently than the ones before them. Not louder, but clearer. Heads turned, not all at once, but gradually following the direction of his gaze. I didn't move. I didn't raise my hand or signal back. I just met his eyes. "She's been there for me," he continued, "not just for school or things like that, just in general." There was a slight pause, as if he were choosing his next words carefully, and I don't think I've said that out loud before. The room remained quiet, not silent, but attentive in a way that felt focused rather than scattered. Ethan took a small breath. "So, thank you," he said. Simple, uncomplicated, but complete. For a moment, nothing else followed. Then the applause came stronger this time, less polite, more certain. I could feel it around me, the shift in the room, the way attention moved again, but this time in a different direction. Not toward the stage, but toward the space where I sat. I didn't react outwardly. I didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, recognition hadn't been something I provided. It had been something I received. The applause lingered longer than I expected, not because of what had been said, but because of how it had been said. Simple, unrehearsed, certain in a way that didn't need explanation. Ethan handed the microphone back and stepped away from it, his shoulders easing slightly as he returned to his place on the stage. The program moved on, as it always does, but something had shifted in the room, subtle but unmistakable. I remained seated. Not out of hesitation, but because I didn't feel the need to move toward anything. For once, I wasn't trying to close a distance that someone else had created. When the event ended, people began to stand, conversations picking up again in overlapping threads. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Parents gathered their things, turning toward their children with smiles and outstretched arms. I waited a moment before standing, letting the space clear just enough. Then I saw him. Ethan was already moving through the crowd, weaving past groups of people with a kind of quiet determination. He didn't look toward the front where his parents were. He didn't hesitate. He came straight to me. "Hi," he said, slightly out of breath, as if he had hurried. "Hi," I answered, matching his tone. For a moment, we just stood there, neither of us quite sure what to say next. Then he shifted his weight, glancing down briefly before looking back up. "I meant what I said," he added, "on stage." "I know," I said. There was no need to make it bigger than it was. That seemed to relax him a little. "I wasn't sure if you were going to come," he admitted. I said I would. "Yeah," he said, almost smiling. "You always do." The words were simple, but they carried something more than they appeared to. Consistency, not as an obligation, as a choice. "I'm glad you did," he said after a moment. "So am I." We stood there for a few seconds longer, the noise of the room moving around us without pulling us into it. "Are you staying?" he asked. For a little while I said, "Are you—" He nodded. "There. Somewhere up there." He tilted his head slightly toward the front of the room. I followed his gesture briefly, then looked back at him. "You should go find them," I said. "I will," he replied. "In a minute." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just unfilled. Then he did something small, but deliberate. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. Not quickly, not out of habit, carefully. I returned the embrace, just as gently, aware of the way it settled, solid, real, without expectation attached to it. When he stepped back, there was something steadier in his expression. "I'll see you soon," he said. "I'd like that." He nodded once, then turned and moved back into the crowd, this time toward the front. I watched him go, not with a sense of loss, but with a quiet understanding of what had just taken place. It hadn't fixed anything, but it had clarified something, and that was enough. I was gathering my things when I noticed Ryan. He wasn't looking at me directly, not at first. He stood a few feet away speaking to someone, but his attention shifted in small, distracted ways, glancing toward me, then away again, as if unsure whether to approach. It wasn't the certainty I had seen in him before. It was something else, something more tentative. When the conversation he was in came to a natural pause, he turned fully in my direction. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he walked over. "Hey," he said. "Hi." His tone was different, less certain, less immediate. "I heard what Ethan said," he added. "I imagine you did." He nodded, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to mine. "That was—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Unexpected." "Yes," I said. "It was." Another pause followed. Not tense, just unstructured. "I didn't know he felt that way," Ryan said. I didn't respond to that right away, not because I disagreed, but because I understood what he was actually saying. I didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't look for it. "He notices more than you think," I said. Ryan let out a quiet breath, his shoulders shifting slightly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess he does." There was something quieter in him now, not an apology, not yet, but a change in direction, small, uncertain, real. He glanced toward the stage again, then back at me. "Look," he said, his voice lower now, "I know things have been off. That's one way to put it." He gave a faint, almost reluctant smile at that. "I'm not going to try to fix everything right now," he continued. "I don't think I could, even if I wanted to." I listened. "But maybe we can talk," he added, "at some point." The words hung there, not as a demand, not as an expectation, as an option. I considered them carefully, not for what they used to mean, but for what they might mean now. Maybe I said. It wasn't a refusal, but it wasn't an agreement either, and that mattered. Ryan nodded once as if he understood the difference. "Okay," he said. We stood there for a moment longer, the space between us no longer defined by urgency, but not yet settled into anything familiar either. Then he stepped back. "I should go," he said, glancing toward where Ethan had disappeared into the crowd. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and walked away. I watched him go the same way I had watched Ethan, not with expectation, not with assumption, just awareness. Things were changing, not all at once, not completely, but enough that I could see it, and for now that was all I needed. I didn't leave right away. After Ryan walked back toward the front of the room, I remained where I was for a few moments longer, letting everything settle without trying to shape it into something final. There was no clear resolution waiting for me, no moment where everything would return to what it had been. And I realized quietly that I didn't want it to. I stepped outside into the evening air, the coolness brushing gently against my skin as the sounds from inside faded behind me. The parking lot was calmer now, a few scattered conversations, the distant hum of engines starting. For a long time I had measured things by what I gave. Time, attention, money. I thought that if I kept showing up in those ways, it would hold something together that mattered. But standing there with nothing left to prove and nothing left to manage, I understood something that felt both simple and unfamiliar. I didn't need to keep giving in the same way to still care. I drove home slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere else. The house greeted me the same way it always had, quiet, steady, unchanged. But this time the stillness didn't feel like something I had to fill. It felt like something I could finally step into. Over the next few days, things didn't settle into anything predictable. Ryan didn't call again right away. When he did, it was brief, practical. There were questions about logistics, about adjustments, about what would happen next, but the urgency that had once driven those conversations was different now, measured, careful. Melissa didn't reach out again, and I didn't expect her to. Ethan, however, did. A short message the next afternoon. "Can I come by sometime this week?" I read it with a small pause, not because I needed to think about the answer, but because I wanted to recognize what it meant. "Yes," I replied. "Any time." He came 2 days later, arriving with the same quiet certainty he had shown at the event. We didn't talk about what had happened in detail. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about school, about small things, about plans that hadn't been shaped by expectation. At one point, he looked around the house and said almost to himself, "It's nice here." I smiled. It always has been. What changed wasn't the space. It was how I was allowed to exist within it. Later, after he left, I walked through the rooms without rushing, noticing the way everything felt more defined, not emptier, clearer. There were still things to finalize, documents to review, conversations that would come in time whether they were easy or not. But none of it felt like something I had to resolve all at once, because for the first time in years I wasn't trying to hold everything together on my own. I was simply choosing where I stood. Ryan would have to figure things out, not because I had abandoned him, but because I had stopped standing in the place that kept him from doing it. And whether that brought distance or something different entirely, I was willing to let it unfold without forcing it into something familiar. I paused in the living room, my hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, and let the quiet settle around me, not heavy, not empty, but steady in a way that didn't ask anything more from me. For a long time, I believed that love meant continuing no matter how uneven things became. Now I see it differently, that sometimes it means stepping back and letting things find their own shape. If you were in my place, would you have kept helping, or would you have stepped back the way I did? Tell me honestly, what would you have done if this story stayed with you? Take a moment to like the video so it can reach someone who might need to hear it. And if you know someone who's been carrying more than they should, share this with them. If you want more stories like this, quiet, real, and honest, subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the hardest thing to change is the part of our lives we quietly learn to accept.